Good evening, gentlemen.
Good evening.
Slade arrived in London in 1876, hoping to exploit a rich new market with the proof he claimed to offer of communication with the dead. Some were skeptical.
You have a question?
2 young medical students set out to expose him.
Keep it in your mind.
Slade's speciality was producing spirit messages on slates of the kind that children would work on at school. He would first show that the slates were blank.
Place your hands upon the slate.
Mysterious sounds of writing would be heard, and then, as if by divine means, a message would appear, supposedly from the spirit of Slade's late wife.
Time will tell.
In this trick, the message is prepared beforehand, but disguised with a false flap. When the 2 slates are placed together, the flap drops onto the slate opposite, and the writing is revealed.
I want you to place these slates above your head, and then think of that question. What are you doing?
You are an imposter, sir. Give me those back!
Slade was arrested for fraud, and his trial at the Old Bailey was the talk of London for some weeks. He narrowly escaped jail, but his case had revealed deep divisions among scientists over the authenticity of spiritualism. Charles Darwin contributed the substantial sum of £10 towards the prosecution. But Alfred Russel Wallace, who had developed the theory of evolution alongside Darwin, was a key witness for Slade's defense. It was a perfect example of the clash between science and religion in the late 19th century.
When Darwin came along with his radical theory of survival of the fittest and evolution, that was rather a blow to the religionists. Of course, they felt that their belief in the literal truth of the Bible was being challenged, and indeed it was.
So they gave up their religion, but they wanted something else in its place. They were looking for something that's more consistent with the new scientism, as it was called at that time. And when spiritualism come along, and a spiritualist said, look, we don't ask you to believe on faith anymore. We're going to give you scientific evidence. We're going to give material proof.
Mediums were quick to supply the evidence that the scientists were looking for in the form of a mysterious new substance from the spirit realm.
It was called ectoplasm. It was a very good and scientific sounding word, and everybody embraced it immediately.
And this was a time when the most extraordinary scientific opening up, if you like, was going on. The Curies were discovering radioactivity, and Roentgen had just discovered X-rays. But I mean, if you can have X-rays, why not ectoplasm, a much less worrying sort of phenomenon?
But I think the vast majority of the people in science at that time were quite receptive. I mean, you look back, Barrett, Brooks, William James, all these people who were progressive thinkers at the time, you know, dabbled in these areas. Some of them, like H.G. Wells and others, dabbled even in occultism. This was much more respectable in those days. And it was really considered a more secular way of seeing these phenomena.
Ectoplasm bore a striking resemblance to muslin. It tended to appear only after the medium had been out of sight for a while in a so-called spirit cabinet, a convenient curtain or screen behind which to prepare such spirit phenomena. The term ectoplasm had been coined by the Nobel Prize-winning physiologist Charles Richet. His star subject was the flamboyant medium Eusapia Palladino. Richet conducted an investigation of Eusapia at his cottage in the south of France. He was convinced that Eusapia's phenomena were produced by spirit hands formed from ectoplasm. This contrasted with the theory of a famous Italian scientist who was sure that the phenomena emanated from pure sex energy and were even accompanied by orgasms.
She would moil and toil and groan, and finally some physical manifestation would take place. Tables would rise, bells would ring, melons would be thrown. I mean, you name it, she did it.
Richer persisted in his theory that these effects were produced by ectoplasmic hands, though they seemed human enough, and they could feel painfully real.
Palladino was very well known for being able to skillfully substitute one hand or one foot for another. So she would ask investigators on either side of her to hold onto her hands to place their feet on top of her feet so they had control of her.
But in the semi-darkness, she was able to free one of her hands to do its spirit business, while the sitters were convinced they had control of both of them. Eusapia was just as good at slipping a foot out of this so-called control. She had her own table made from light wood, which she could lift by getting a foot under the table's leg, and she was frequently exposed in such trickery. Other effects might be produced by an accomplice. But Richer couldn't believe that such an ill-educated woman could be deceiving him.
The believers are so purposely blind when they want to be. They believed in Palladino because she was an ignorant Italian peasant, and that's an expression they used frequently. She was a very cunning Italian peasant.
Lots of the early investigators of paranormal claims felt that just because they were eminent scientists, they couldn't be fooled. They were professional observers, they couldn't be fooled. Lots of conjurers will actually argue that they are easier to fool than children because of the logical way in which they think, because of the sequential nature of their thought processes.
Having produced ectoplasmic body parts, mediums then tried full-form materializations. These pictures of the medium Eva Carrière were probably more convincing in the early, innocent days of photography than they are today.
She produced quite a number of heads, which are clearly folded and flat. She also produced a full-form materialization that she called Dors Mica, which had a rather neat little black beard and specs and a sort of lab coat. And he too is extremely flat.
Eva often performed in the nude, which perhaps distracted from Dors Mica's flatness. His face was later shown to be a magazine photograph of the King of Bulgaria. Before long, materializations became much more lifelike. Once inside her cabinet, the medium would apparently be securely tied and go into a trance. After a while, a spirit would emerge. It moved, it breathed. It might even give you a kiss or shake hands. In fact, it looked for all the world like someone dressed up as a ghost. But the faithful wanted to believe that the spirits were genuine.
If it looked like a ghost, it talked like a ghost, or a dead relative, you know, it seemed reasonable to think it might be a dead relative.
There were occasions when the spirit form was grabbed and indeed identified as the medium. What would typically happen then is that the other sitters would take great exception to the fact that the spirit had been grabbed. This was definitely not the thing to do in a Victorian séance. It was against the rules. And it was even alleged that this would actually kill the medium, which in fact it never did. But the spirit form would then be hustled back behind the curtain, and then 5 minutes later the somewhat dishevelled medium would apparently come out of her trance and claim to have no knowledge of what had taken place.
With one exception, all practicing mediums were exposed as frauds, or else quite often confessed.
This diminished neither the popularity of spiritualism nor the controversy over its supernatural claims. So Scientific American magazine decided to put an end to the debate once and for all. They offered a $5,000 prize to anyone who could prove a genuine psychic phenomenon. But it takes a trickster to spot a trickster, and to win the prize, mediums would have to convince the greatest illusionist and skeptic of them all, Harry Houdini.